Good morning, colleagues. My name is Jonathan Ray. I'm a veterinary surgeon whose career has been spent in first opinion practice in the UK since the early 1980s. This gives me 40 years of the experience of our professional life and a perspective on our professional life informed by that long experience. Today, I'd like to look at our Royal College and one of the RCVS's key performance indicators, that is, engagement with the profession, as it is assessed annually at RCVS Council election time measured by eligible voter turnout percentage. These days, compared with 6 to 7 years ago, it's actually more difficult to find out RCVS KPI data, but for engagement, we have a data set going back 20 years to look at absolute performance and trends in engagement. Firstly, some definitions and concepts. Eligible voters. Well, for each year, the data has been taken from RCVS's definition of eligible voters at that time to maintain consistency. It should be noted that the absolute numbers of eligible voters as opposed to the percentage voting has vastly increased. So where in 2023 the voting percentage is 16.7%, this represents 6,000 veterinary surgeons from an eligible voter base of 36,500 veterinary surgeons. In 2005, the 18% who voted derived from 3,500 ballot papers returned, grossed up to an eligible voter base of just short of 20,000. Thus, from 2005 to 2023, there has been an increase in eligible voters of 82%. The willingness of an eligible voter to make a choice and undertake the necessary process to register their preference is called engagement. Engagement is a political concept, particularly here because it is attached to a voting event. Turnout. The percentage of eligible voters who registered a preference. This is a KPI for the RCVS and the subject of this video essay. Turnout is given objectivity and measurability by using the annual percentage of voter base. A percentage of eligible voters is used for comparison for each year in these 20 years, again for the sake of consistency. RCVS history, events, people, politics, and policy. To give context to the analysis, we will be looking at the turnout as a timeline and correlating the timeline with contextual issues relating to RCVS history, events, people, politics, and policy extant at RCVS. The contextual issues chosen have some subjectivity, some choices made by us to keep this video to a manageable presentation. Some examples of RCVS workings which are not included would be the administration of registration process or remuneration of staff and council. Overton window. This is defined here as the spectrum of ideas on policy and issues considered acceptable by the RCVS Council and its officers at a given time. Where this overlaps with the prevailing zeitgeist of the profession at large, beyond RCVS, is an area that can be reasonably explored to explain engagement, or lack of it. Insights. This essay will be punctuated by summaries, which we are calling insights. These are short summaries derived from RCVS publication and polemic, or important moments on the timeline. I'd like to begin with this illustration of the RCVS election turnout. As you can see, we have the table of turnout percentage by year and the charting of the data. The average turnout over the last 20 years is 18.72%. The chief executive of RCVS has, in the past, commented that this is not particularly unusual for regulatory bodies within the UK, but it's difficult to verify her assertion. It's also difficult to understand why the veterinary profession, one of the very few self-regulating professions, should be compared to other regulators like the GMC or more broadly the PSA in this respect. Furthermore, there's a whiff of complacency about being satisfied that this average turnout is not at all unusual. The schematic shows the highest turnout was on the 28th of April 2020, a month after COVID lockdown in the UK. At this time, Eleanor Ferguson, RCVS Registrar and Returning Officer, said the remarkable turnouts would strengthen the college's governance and maintain the profession's self-regulatory status.
Insight 1. RCVS see the high point of their KPI at 26.2% engagement as remarkable, which is consistent with previously stated much lower expectation, and go on to frame this as good for the RCVS in respect of validating its governance and status. No comment is made about the support from the profession.
By 2023, in response to the current turnout of 16.7%, down from 18.8%, Eleanor Ferguson had said,
2023. As part of our wider council culture project, we are looking at how to increase engagement with our election processes. Across the board, from candidate nominations, to how we present information about the candidates, to how we encourage greater election turnout. We will be consulting with the group set up to look specifically at this issue in due course to see how we can improve turnout going forward.
Thus, RCVS is currently responding to a well below average KPI by looking at the process and consulting internally, which contrasts sharply with a similar downturn in 2011. At that time, the RCVS Registrar Jane Hearn expressed disappointment that voting figures in that year's elections to the RCVS, also on April the 28th, showed that 15.9% of the electorate voted in the RCVS council elections that year, compared with 18.8% in 2010. She went on to say,
2011. It's certainly disappointing that the turnout has dropped so much this year. It's unclear whether this is due to lack of time, lack of awareness, or lack of interest. But perhaps anyone who didn't vote could let us know why, so we can see what we could do to increase participation.
In 2011, the registrar, in one of her final comments, showed a willingness to admit disappointment, speculate about the causes of a dismal turnout, and invite those who were not engaged to tell RCVS why they weren't engaged. She even went so far as to make it an albeit qualified commitment to improvement at RCVS. Well, as it turned out, Ms. Hearn's tenure was abruptly terminated shortly thereafter, and the opportunity she offered came to naught.
Insight 2. In 2023 RCVS have rationalised a dismal turnout to be about process, and will consult within itself to improve turnout. In 2011, under similar circumstances, RCVS were willing, at least theoretically, to hear from the disengaged voters, to see what could be done.
Having looked at the RCVS attitude towards the highs and lows of turnout, I'd like to move on to the turnout chart itself. This can be broken down into 4 phases. In the first phase shown here, running up to 2010, there was little change in voter engagement. In the second, 2011 to 2016, engagement was choppy. Third, 2017 to 2020, there was the upturn in engagement. And the fourth, there is the decline in engagement, 2021 to 2023. For the timeline graphic, we've broken down each of the phases by year, showing turnout, the sitting president, and the key issues that year. Slide 1 shows the years from 2003 until 2007, notable for Parker's call to persuade the profession about the merits of the RCVS in 2004, running through to the humiliation of RCVS at the EFRICOM meetings in 2007. Slide 2 takes us from 2008 to 2010, with an RCVS about to go into a phase of profound turmoil because of severe governance problems. Sadly, Parker's ambition to persuade us of RCVS merits are a distant memory by now. At this time, Lord Trees made an important comment in his closing speech as President, which we will be returning to. The President described how a single year as President was somewhat frustrating, as it was not really long enough to get anything done. And this comment is particularly pertinent when we look at the next slide, which shows a parallel timeline linked to prominent employees at RCVS, the Chief Executive and the Registrar. As you can see, there have been two CEOs, Mr. Stace from 2012 to 2017, and then long-serving Ms. Lockett from 2017 until the present. There have also been three registrars in this time. Ms. Hearn left in 2011. She was followed by Mr. Hockey, who was there until 2016, and from that time, Ms. Ferguson, also a long-serving employee, has been in post.
Insight 3. Single presidential years don't get anything done, according to Lord Trees. For that you need to be at RCVS for longer, particularly at the highest level, in the officer team. Later, we'll consider whether having successive presidents, all with the same agenda, achieves what Trees couldn't. In the meantime, we'll note that RCVS employees spend years on the officer team. In other words, they meet Trees' criterion for achieving change, but they are unelected and cannot be engaged with.
The next part of the timeline takes us to the first part of an episode at RCVS when it was being radically overhauled and reorganised, a move necessitated ultimately by the uncovering of an eye-watering overspend on the RCVS's IT systems and refurbishment of parts of Belgravia House. In this time, there was choppy engagement, oscillating around the 20-year average. There was also little of note to inspire voters as RCVS bedded in its new way of working in support of a strategy to become, by their own measure, a first-rate regulator. These years were all about RCVS getting used to new internal systems and a new leadership model. The working of a bloated council was becoming an increasing administrative burden for the new governance model, and its own inertia prevented any inspirational or new thinking to enhance engagement. Then came the first signs of change in 2017. Engagement rose from the average to 26.2% in 2020, an increase of nearly 40%, which had not been seen before. We'll be discussing why this might be a bit later, because this deserves a longer commentary. The fourth phase, the decline, starts with Green's presidential year associated with the drop to 2022, a downturn of nearly 32%. Then even further in Richard's year as president to the lamentable 16.7% engagement in 2023. Beyond a basic timeline to establish context, there are some further relevant observations. These are:
the elections take place mostly in April, the presidents take over from their predecessor in July, so, as far as the figurehead of RCVS is concerned, they are visible for 8 to 9 months prior to the election taking place, in their presidential year. Once they become presidents, then as Bogue observed, one thing, as president, you have, is a platform. And given Trees' observation about what can be achieved with single-year presidencies, there is a temptation to make the most of your platform in that time, for your own views. That platform now includes social media resources, underwritten by RCVS, which were not available to Trees in 2010. Instagram was in its infancy, for instance, but this all ramped up in 2017, and subsequent years. The next timing point relates to the so-called societal generations. The baby boomer generation are those born between 1946 and 1964. Generation X between 1965 and 1981, Gen Y, also known as millennials, born 1982 to 1994, and most intriguingly Gen Z, born after 1994, because these have now become eligible voters in RCVS elections from 2017 onwards. Gen Z are the first generation for whom internet access, smartphones, and social media have been formative prior to tertiary education, particularly from 2010 onwards, with the arrival of Instagram. RCVS increasing use of social media, from 2017, neatly coincides with the arrival of this generation of voters at 1,000 graduates a year.
Social media, as a vehicle for engagement, became a reality. And the population it could reach well versed in the methodology. Now, in 2019, the workforce survey showed that the average age of men in the profession was 51. That is, mainly Gen X. And women, 40, mainly Gen Y. With women making up 65% of eligible voters. RCVS have not published demographic data since 2020. So it is not possible to give up-to-date figures here. But there is no reason to believe that sex demographic and graduate number trends have changed. And every reason to believe that the eligible voter base is increasing. That it is substantially women. That these voters are mainly millennials. And Gen Z is coming up strongly. Thus, we should look at how millennial and Gen Z women engaged with RCVS 2017 to 2020. Then disengaged in much larger numbers. Because of large graduate numbers between 2017 and 2023. Plans and politics. With the arrival of a CEO at RCVS in 2012 and the need to rehabilitate RCVS, RCVS produced a series of strategic plans. Initially, Stace produced the 2014 to 2016 plan. Then Lockett authored the 2017 to 2019 plan and published this to the profession on 16th January 2017, 2 months before the election. This plan laid open the ambition for identity politics, a fashionable metropolitan discourse to become the norm at RCVS. The latest plan, 2020 to 2024, was published on 5th May 2020, 2 months into COVID restrictions, and supported the Overton window, created in the previous couple of years by Presidents Bogue, Connell, and Green. The history of the RCVS at this time and its political aims are covered by the VSA and is outside the scope of this video. We have provided a link to those series of videos in the information below. They are well worth a look. Personalities and politics. The RCVS has always maintained that it is not the place for single-issue dogma. Thus, for years, candidates for election, who had a specific drum they were beating, very loudly at times, were discouraged. Those who were elected, who had a less stridently articulated primary concern, like the Veterinary Surgeons Act, or tidying up regulation around 24/7 cover, had their single concern diluted by stints on committees, thus protecting RCVS from the influence of single-issue dogma. However, in 2017, Lockett, together with Bogue, Connell, and Green began single-issue politics, which, once again, is better covered by the VSA in their video series. We have links in the description.
Insight 4. If we summarize matters of timing and context, then from 2017, the profession's awareness of the presidential year to date was platformed and amplified by greater use of social media. There was the arrival, annually, of a cohort of 1,000 social media susceptible voters. There was also a bulge of millennial women voters. A new strategic plan was published, which laid the groundwork for fashionable politics, and there was the creation of an Overton window to exploit the single issue, identitarian politics, of a succession of presidents, an ideology, stretching across presidencies, and achieving what trees could not, back in 2010, when there was no such common ideology between presidencies.
There are some further observations worth making about the election itself, just how representative the outcome of the elections are, reasons for voting, and what little we know about why eligible voters vote in RCVS elections. The election itself. Well, as far back as 2005, the election was presented as an authentic opportunity to influence RCVS.
In view of this, the RCVS Council elections are also important, as they give members a chance to influence the decisions that will be made. And given the range of activities undertaken by the profession, and the challenges currently confronting it, it remains important that its regulatory body reflects the breadth of expertise available within the profession, and puts this to best effect. This is another reason for members to consider the candidates' statements, and exercise their right to vote. With so much at stake, it is surprising that more members do not vote in the council elections. More members voted in last year's election, 2004, than in previous years, but the proportion was still low, at 18%. Low electoral returns are causing concern, and it has been suggested that this is because voters are unable to relate to the issues. This should not be the case in the veterinary field. No veterinary surgeons are unaffected by the decisions made by their regulatory body.
The election itself is required by the VSA 1966 to appoint councillors to whatever type of council RCVS has at any given time. But it is not authentically democratic representative type of election. There's no obligation for the candidate elected to follow up on any aspect of their manifesto, and indeed they can announce new priorities at any time. Thus, when Bogue became president, she announced that diversity is my number one issue, whilst barely mentioning it in her election manifesto. Furthermore, those who hold power who are on the officer team are not elected. The CEO and registrar are full-time employees, and the rest of the officer team are picked by a rather obscure process from the available members of council. These officers are now being picked from a smaller and less diverse council than previously, and with a prevailing identity politics agenda, there's no surprise which direction the internal promotions take when it is packed with identity politics supporters, as happened between 2018 and 2022. You won't get on the officer team if your face doesn't fit and your politics don't sit within the Overton window, as evidenced by Richard's presidency, which came about at very short notice when Argyll was cancelled by extra-procedural, extrajudicial pressures. And with the appointment of the new treasurer, an inexperienced foreign graduate, we see it again. This all begs the question for the voter of why should I vote when I won't be represented? My choice of candidate does what they like, and those in positions of power operate a tribal political bias. And just to return to an earlier point made by the current registrar in 2020, when the turnout topped 26%, the RCVS sees high election turnout as good for the RCVS in respect of validating its governance and status. In other words, it's nothing to do with representing the profession. So when this sort of thing is said, it also begs the question for any voter of what's in it for me? The outcome of the election. Well, the outcome of the election creates an illusion of representation. Even RCVS has an inkling of this being an illusion, so we have Councillor Dyer, who articulated this in a general fashion in 2018.
Dyer later told Vet Record, "I have a sneaking suspicion that we, the RCVS Council, aren't in the slightest bit representative of the profession. But if we don't have the data, we don't know."
Only to have this reframed by the CEO as an intersectional problem of the profession itself, rather than a representation or policy problem at RCVS.
Lockett said that the RCVS also wished to explore if it was adequately reflecting its membership in terms of the level at which members were working in the veterinary profession and the type of veterinary practitioner they were. Compiling accurate statistics of this kind could help ensure that representation on the council is suitably balanced, Lockett suggested. However, RCVS have not compiled or published this sort of data since 2020. In addition, she said, the RCVS would be considering diversity in all its guises, and challenging ourselves as to what does diversity mean. She explained, to some people, it means ethnic diversity and social mobility. For others, It means who's working where in the profession. Is the RCVS Council representative of the profession it serves? The next step, which is possibly even more challenging, is not only asking is Council representative of the profession, but is the profession representative of the public that it serves? This last comment infuriated many, who saw it as a deflection, a diversionary tactic to avoid having to take action at source.
Lockett's verbal gymnastics and reframing of the representation concern as being exogenous rather than endogenous was not lost on voters, and by questioning the validity of the profession from whom the voter base is drawn, she was, perhaps deliberately, failing to make a compelling case to engage with RCVS. Her words beg the question for voters why RCVS should think the profession should represent the public rather than provide a service for the public, as they always have. Why should we vote if RCVS questions the basis of all we do from a platform we cannot influence? We've already covered the historical and largely inaccurate reason for voting, that this allows the profession to influence council and therefore the policy and direction at RCVS. And in more modern times, the issue that has been writ large as a reason for voting is connected to transparency, openness and honesty. In the 2017 Strategic Plan, page 4, RCVS commits to being honest and transparent. But by 2020, the following was being reported.
11 former members of RCVS Council have taken the unusual step of writing to the college, to urge it to be transparent over new proposals, surrounding disciplinary hearings. 2 former RCVS presidents, Jackie Molyneux and Barry Johnson, were among the signatories to the open letter, addressed to current RCVS President Neil Connell. Their call follows last month's interventions, from 2 serving members of RCVS Council, including past President Stephen May, who also raised the issue of transparency. May, along with Martin Peaty, who was elected to RCVS Council in 2017, queried the way in which some council reports and discussions had been classified as confidential.
And the highly experienced RCVS councillor Stevenson, who was re-elected in the 2020 elections, wrote,
"I believe that the high turnout, and the fact that 2 new candidates have been elected demonstrates a desire for change, in the manner in which council has recently conducted itself, particularly that members want more openness, and to be involved in decision-making."
The concerns expressed about the absence of following through on a strategic plan commitment relating to being honest and transparent, especially because this came from senior and respected colleagues, provided a very good reason to vote. Simple articles of faith like honesty and truth and openness cut to the core of a professional person's identity, and when these are seen to be problematic, then voters will turn out for elections expecting the opportunity to influence reform. But then these voters will also walk away if the process for change, for reform, fails to achieve any signs of Stevenson's desire for change. And predictably, we have seen that fall off in turnout to current levels. Well, why do voters choose a particular candidate? There's very little known about why voters do or do not vote in RCVS elections, but there's also little known about how they choose a candidate. In the public domain, there are 2 accounts of note. There is Treves-Brown from 2012 and Shammings from 2020.
The acting RCVS registrar has just initiated the annual election of members to the RCVS Council. When the results of the election are declared, we will have the ritual hand-wringing that over 80% of MEMS RCVS did not vote. This will be attributed to their being too indolent, or unconcerned. But is this a correct assessment of the attitudes of non-voters? I have always voted, but every year I ask myself why, and wonder whether my selection of candidates is made on wrong criteria. I read the manifestos of the candidates, and note that they usually consist of platitudinous undertakings to represent the interests of practicing MEMS RCVS. In any case, experience shows that these undertakings are rarely fulfilled. Council time, and our attention fees, are taken up with such matters as disciplinary procedures, which affect only about 1 in 2,000 RCVS in a year. So my selection is normally made on personal grounds rather than political concerns. I do sometimes make a positive decision not to vote for a candidate. For example, there was an RCVS council member, who, in an informal conversation, loftily implied that issues of concern to me were of no interest to the RCVS council. I, there and then, decided never to vote for him. And I have not. But this tactical voting is motivated more by a concern about the agenda of the RCVS council, than by a partisan interest in the decisions that might be made there. I shall probably vote again this year, but I remain unhappy about the agenda of the RCVS council. Would it be a more honest expression of my opinions, if I were to join the majority of them's RCVS who do not vote and deliberately abstained?
During my time in the profession, I have felt that the RCVS was a body worthy of my respect. As a mere practitioner, at the coalface of the profession, I have also felt that it is an organization that I prefer to steer clear of. Over the years, I have performed my duty and voted at the annual elections. Like most people, I know so little about the candidates. I generally vote for the faces I like the best. People from practice who would represent my views generally do not have enough time for veterinary politics. I presume the RCVS is answerable to no one, except to the people who elect the 15 vets. The remainder are appointed, so it is especially important that it carries out its activities in a proper and transparent manner.
When the registrar indicated that she would be looking at processes across the board, from candidate nominations to how we present information about the candidates to how we encourage greater election turnout, looking at process, she should probably have taken into account how voters and non-voters behave, because the nomination process and presentation of information don't figure as important in either Trees Brown or Shamming's account. Finding out whether these versions of how the profession votes are representative would be a useful thing for RCVS to know, so as to inform their efforts to improve turnout, and for that, RCVS needs to go out to the profession rather than consult internally. Having fleshed out relevant events, politics and process in order to create context, we'd like to return to the bump in election turnout, the surge from 2017 to 20 and the decline from 2021 to 2023. The uplift part of the bump has two phases: the uplift from a very low trough of 15.6% in 2016, with a plateau 17 to 18, and then a second uplift to 2020. The decline has a downward trajectory from 2020 to 2023. In our opinion, there is no single causative factor for the uplift, rather it is multifactorial. The time leading up to 2017 results, along with people, policy and socio-political context, have already been discussed, but these are all correlative, and it has to be a combined effect that gets us closer to understanding the upswing. So here are some factors in no particular order and given no score as to level of influence for the upswing from 2017 onwards. A wish to see more women on council and as presidents. In 2017, there'd only been one female president since 2010 and only 4 since 2003. After 2018, there's only one man, Connell. This could only happen by more women being voted onto council, elected by men and women voters. This looks like a persisting effect. Another reason for the upswing is a legacy effect from Stacey's work to rehabilitate RCVS. Stace managed to take the perception of RCVS from a broken, ill-managed organisation to something more coherent and interesting with aspirational values. This had its attractions for voters, otherwise used to something stale and inefficient. The current CEO, Stacey's successor, is clearly not enjoying this effect 5 years after their appointment. A greater reach by RCVS through social media and more professional process. 2017 saw an increase in the sophistication of contact reminders and interaction in the voting process. This had a particular novelty appeal to tech-savvy millennials and incoming Gen Z. Well, the novelty of that process is over now. From 2018 onwards, RCVS cast itself as a champion of victim groupings, the mentally ill, and those who perceived or experienced discrimination. And they set up the discourse on diversity, inclusion, and equality. This was fashionable and appealing for a caring profession, so could easily have motivated voters, especially younger voters. But we have no definitive data published on the demographic of voters for any year. This data is available to the contractor used for voting purposes, and whatever else we can say about it, the novelty in the politics is over now. There may have been a small COVID lockdown effect. In 2019, the turnout was 25.5%, and the main part of the uplift was over. The 2020 election came a few weeks after lockdown, but only saw a small 0.7% increase in turnout. RCVS had not formulated a position in respect of how they were going to regulate during this time, so it's reasonable to assume that the continued levels of turnout were a lingering effect of whatever appeal had driven up numbers in 2018-2019. Any COVID effect is over now. 2020 was the zenith for turnout. Connell was elected president, Bogue was senior vice president, and Green junior vice president. Along with Lockett as CEO, the power at RCVS lay firmly with the people with the identitarian political agenda. To this day, no one knows if voters ever voted for their political agenda and gave them a mandate, or whether it was just assumed by them that it'd be okay. In addition, it became clear that Bogue had no experience of primary practice on her CV. Connell's experience was relatively short and somewhat dated. Green's experience limited and non-committal, and none of them were in practice at that time to understand the existential threats the profession felt in lockdown as work disappeared, colleagues were furloughed, and our future looked bleak. This is all explained in much more detail in the VSA videos previously mentioned, and there's a link to them in the description box below. 2020 also marked the rise of the concerns mentioned previously about transparency at RCVS, all of which went unheeded. Furthermore, things took a sinister turn when the officers sanctioned an investigation into an alleged leak relating a desire for RCVS to change the level of proof to convict in disciplinary cases. This was widely interpreted as showing a lack of trust in the capacity of the profession to understand the issues being discussed at RCVS, a lack of transparency and honesty generally, and the setting of a chilling precedent of intrusive investigation for any elected council member who failed to agree with any aspect of RCVS policy and made that known publicly. From 2020 to 2023, whatever appeal RCVS had for eligible voters waned quickly and was not replaced by anything new to motivate engagement. Even as the number of eligible voters increased, social media usage became mainstream rather than a novelty, and the effects of COVID working faded away. So what does the average voter RCVS is trying to engage with in 2024 look like? 2020 was the last time RCVS published any demographic data on the profession, although the 2019 workforce study of 13,000 members of the profession was recycled in the Diversity and Inclusion Group strategy document. From that data, we can see that most eligible voters are women who are heterosexual, around 40 in age, sound in mind and body, and reflect the ethnicity of the UK population in general. To that, we can add that they have all demonstrated high levels of cognitive ability by getting into universities at a time when only the highest grade A-levels were acceptable. And from the discussions surrounding the RCVS's own Workforce Summit outcomes, we can understand the importance to them of having a family life to complement their career. None of them make claims to special intersectional victimhood status. Rather, they want clear recognition of their professional status and that any privilege they have is earned and not conditional upon immutable characteristics. So why can't RCVS engage this so-called average voter? That should be the subject of challenge and debate. Sadly, there's no forum for such a debate. The Workforce Summit webinars only serve to reinforce the characteristics of this average voter. They had no role in meeting the need for an organised, long-term and detailed examination of how to engage the profession. And if the registrar's analysis is correct, that RCVS's governance will improve and its status controlling the regulation of the profession is enhanced by high levels of engagement, it's truly puzzling why RCVS have not set up just such a forum for challenge and debate.
In 2017, 22.8% of eligible voters voted, a total of 6,785 voters, from a voter base of 29,750. In 2020, 26.2% of eligible voters voted, a total of 8,834 voters, from a voter base of 33,700, representing an additional 2,049 voters. By 2023, 16.7% voted, a total of 6,087 votes, from a voter base of 36,300, meaning fewer voters engaged in 2023 than in 2017, in absolute terms, from a base that had increased by 2,600 even from 2020.
This really should be a wake-up call for RCVS, not the profession. So where should we go from here? Well, here are some suggestions. Lockett should not be allowed to obfuscate the concern about lack of engagement as she did in 2018. If she doesn't have something constructive to say, then she should do no harm this time. Ferguson should re-articulate what the return is for the profession in voting, not just RCVS, and should consult with the profession as to how to get more engagement, just as her predecessor offered to do in 2011. The officer team and its election practices should be examined so as to change the politics to align with the modern version of the profession more closely, rather than an elite metropolitan discourse. RCVS should create a forum for debate and challenge for all, but to begin with, a place to engage with the average voter. And finally, the path to re-engaging with the profession could not have a clearer starting point, which is upholding the values of transparency, openness and honesty which caused so many to be concerned in 2020, the beginning of the decline in voter engagement. Thank you for your time, and thanks also to the editorial and production team for their support and resources. See you again.